Hi, my name is Christopher Malagisi, and I'm the Education Director for the Online Conservatism 101 project. On behalf of the Leadership Institute and Free Think U, we'd like to welcome you to this first of its kind Online Conservatism 101 course, which will be an in-depth online class that will review the philosophical and political history of the most influential political movement in modern American history. Myself, along with numerous other conservative scholars and leaders, will be presenting on various aspects of the conservative movement, detailing how what largely started as a marginalized movement of ideas then became a powerful political force in American politics. Many of you are probably familiar with the basic tenets of conservatism, but are interested in digging deeper to learn more about perhaps your own political philosophy, or might just be curious to learn about the other side. This course is not just for students, but for anyone interested in learning more about conservatism. Now, contrary to some, the conservative movement is not a monolithic entity. In fact, it's just the opposite. It is a vast coalition made up of many different strands and branches that represent a collection of ideas and solutions that have withstood the test of history and time. We hope you'll join us over the next 14 sessions as we take a deeper look at the intellectual roots of the conservative movement so that you will take away a much deeper and broader appreciation of a movement that has changed not only America, but the world over. In this first session, we'll be detailing the foundation and roots of American conservatism. In order to begin this discussion, though, we need to ask ourselves a question. What are conservatives inherently trying to conserve? You know, I actually currently teach a course at American University called History of the Conservative Movement. This is the first question I always ask my students on the first day of the first class. Most of the time, the students are perplexed, to be honest with you. It's a question that's not asked as often as it probably should, and is sometimes hard to put into easy-to-understand, digestible terms. You know, typical responses tend to be, well, conservatives want to lower taxes. They tend to be pro-life, and they want to win wars. Okay. But inherently, what are conservatives actually trying to conserve? The answer is America's first principles, or what others might call American exceptionalism. Well, what is American exceptionalism? American exceptionalism is the idea that America is a unique chapter in human history. America is unique not because they were against a tea tax and fought off a colonial power to gain their independence. While important, it's not what makes America unique, as many countries have fought wars of independence before. America is unique because it has claimed a new basis of political legitimacy, that all men are created equal, that political legitimacy is derived from the consent of the governed, and that our rights do not come from government, but come from the laws of nature and of nature's God. Well, what does this mean? Let's take each of those three ideas and let's break them down. First, in the Declaration of Independence, it states that all men are created equal with certain inalienable rights, which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That implies essentially that while individuals might be born in different stations of life and might have different abilities, we are each, though, born equally as a human being, and that no one person may rule over another. If one individual cannot rule over another, would it not then imply that no monarchy, aristocracy, oligarchy, dictator, or otherwise could rightly claim their rule over another? Which leads us to our second principle, that political legitimacy is derived from the consent of the governed, the people. As just stated, if one man cannot rule over another, then it stands that only true political legitimacy comes from the consent of the people collectively. How so? Well, people elect representatives to represent their views in the legislature, elected by the majority of the people, but where also the minority voice is heard as well. This was a historical, fundamental change in political governance, as no society of this magnitude had ever before bestowed political authority to the people themselves. This will lead us to our third principle. If all men are created equally, and true political legitimacy comes from the consent of the governed, then the question must be asked, where do these rights come from? Now, before the American founding, our rights were bestowed upon us through the British common law that passed down from one generation to the next, based on whatever decree the king or the parliament allowed at the time. All of this was based on the idea that only the crown or government could decree our rights. During the Enlightenment, philosophers, including John Locke in particular, concluded that through reason and revelation, we could ascertain certain laws or universal truths. This would be called natural law. Some of you may have heard of this before. From natural law, we could determine certain natural rights that could not be given or taken away by a government, but were inherently infixed to human nature itself. These natural rights consist of, you might find this familiar, life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness, or virtue in one's life. This was also a profound shift in human history. The idea of natural rights essentially meant that there were certain fundamental rights that a government could not create and could not therefore take away from any individual, that instead our natural rights come from the laws of nature and of nature's God. These three principles established the new political legitimacy that was to exist within America. It was this experimental fusion of ideas that formed the basis of our American political experiment. And actually, this is why America is still called to this day the American experiment. It is an experiment because it is a test to see whether or not man can govern themselves, or what Alexander Hamilton would describe in Federalist Paper No. 1, whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. Now, after the Constitutional Convention of 1787, you may have known this story, a woman came up to Ben Franklin and asked what they'd come up with. Ben Franklin famously responded, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." What Franklin meant was that America was to be a republic, a vestige of elected self-governance, where the people would determine their destiny. Now, I know some of you at this point might be thinking, why aren't we discussing the conservative positions on issue A or issue B instead of talking about the founding? It is fundamentally important to remember that conservatives base their heritage and view of government's proper role by understanding our founding principles, based on our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and even the Federalist Papers. Quoting talk radio host Mark Levin from his book Liberty and Tyranny, conservatism is the antidote to tyranny precisely because the principles are the founding principles. In this frame of mind, it must also be understood that the founders believed that liberty alone would not be enough to maintain a republic. Free men not only must have liberty, but must also be guided by experience and prudence to govern justly. In the English language, there are actually two words for freedom: freedom and liberty. The founders did not intend for unlimited freedom, as they knew that this might encroach on another's individual freedom. Therefore, the term liberty always implied more than just rights, but also responsibilities. These responsibilities would be necessary for one's freedom to be secure. Therefore, for liberty to flourish, virtue and tradition must also be cultivated through the civil society. Rights and responsibilities, or sometimes called ordered liberty. Have any of you ever heard of John Stuart Mill's harm principle? The theorem essentially states that individuals should be allowed to be free and do as they please, so long as they do not harm others. I think most people would agree with this principle in theory, but a conservative would ask to then define what harm is. Each person might have a different definition of this. Therefore, a conservative believes in the freedom of the individual, but also believes with great power or freedom comes great responsibility. And there should be a civic virtue and tradition to help guide our freedom. John Adams once said that statesmen may plan and speculate for liberty, but it is religion and morality alone which can establish the principles upon which freedom can securely stand. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. What he was saying was that forming good character, building good community, and promoting civic virtue were all necessary ingredients to promote the Aristotelian idea of the good society. So how should we go about promoting civic virtue, but not trample on the rights of others? The answer is through the civil society, entities not associated with the government. So some of you might be asking, what is civil society? Civil society consists of 4 institutions: our families, schools, churches, and private associations. Civil society would be the bedrock for securing our liberty through its nurturing of civic virtue and responsible citizenship. Now, to preserve our liberty, government was to be limited based on the rule of law and something called negative rights, limiting the government's ability to limit our rights. For example, let's take the First Amendment. The First Amendment begins by stating that, quote, "Congress shall make no law." Now, the founders understood the symbiotic relationship between liberty and governmental power. The more power a government had, the less liberty the individual had. Therefore, a set of rules was necessary to specifically list the proper functions and duties of government, enshrined within the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Now, the founders created a government of checks and balances and a separation of powers, stuff you probably learned in your civic social studies classes growing up. That there were 3 branches of government to make sure that one branch would serve as a check on the other, and each would have its own specific powers. This was a tyranny of the majority, if you will, or a passionate party or faction that could not quickly overtake or abuse government power. The founders knew, though, that they could not anticipate every constitutional issue that might arise, or from time to time the Constitution might need to be amended. Therefore, they ingeniously created Article 5 of the Constitution, which allowed the Constitution to be amended when necessary. But this is only to be used in a very limited fashion. Otherwise, the Constitution was to serve as a type of rule book in administering government. This is why conservatives today promote the concept of, you might have heard of these, judicial restraint or originalism. Originalism is the idea that the original meaning or intent of a law provides consistency from one generation to the next. Like a contract, the law sets expectations so everyone understands the same rules. Lastly, in order to promote a pursuit of happiness, our government also needed to secure our safety. This was to be done through a sovereign independence and strong national defense. In the early days of our republic, George Washington warned us in his farewell address to be wary of foreign entanglements, as the country had nearly been torn apart by the French Revolutionary War between sects of Americans either supporting the French or the British. At the same time, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution clearly states that the federal government's primary responsibility was to provide for the common defense. The Articles of Confederation, our first Constitution actually, have been figuratively thrown out, in part due to the lack of ability of the federal government to create an armed force when necessary, to defend itself and its interests. It would be important for America to always be ready in case of emergencies or to respond to acts of aggression, if necessary, and only as a last resort. It is in this spirit that conservatives today believe in a strong peace-through-strength national defense to defend and protect itself and its interests, though many conservatives differ to the extent of that power. In summary, conservatives trace their heritage to the American founding and deeply believe in the concept of American exceptionalism. America's first principles established a new political legitimacy based on the precepts that all men are created equal, self-governance, and that our natural rights do not come from government, but come from the laws of nature and of nature's God. These inalienable rights consist of life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. But with liberty comes rights and responsibilities, best promoted through a thriving civil society. Maintaining a rule of law, judicial restraint, and a sovereign independence and strong national defense would be tantamount to preserving our American experiment.